The same God who's never late is working all things out, working all things out. Yes, I will lift you high in the lowest valley. Yes, I will bless your name. Yes, I will sing for joy when my heart is heavy on nights. Oh yes, I will, and I choose to praise, to glorify, glorify the name of all names. When nothing can stand against, I'll choose to praise, to glorify, glorify the name of all names. When nothing can stand against, yes, I will lift you high in the lowest valley. Yes, I will bless your name. Yes, I will sing for joy when my heart is heavy on my days. Oh yes, I will for all my days. Oh yes, I will for all my days. Oh yes, I will. Amen. So I lost my monitor somehow, so I'm gonna share some words. All right, here we go. Now, I don't know if the TV turned off or somebody turned off the kids' light room. Sometimes that's what triggers it. And let the King of my heart be the mountain where I run, the mountain I drink from. Oh, he is my song.
trust everyone is looking forward to the new year.
Yes, amen.
All right, 2021 had its good points, and I'm sure some not so good. It's always good to get into a new year. Now, this message this morning, the topic today, and it will form actually a multi-part to be continued, is called Proof That God Exists. You see it behind me. And while this may seem a bit like an academic issue, only for intellectuals who sit around and argue, it's actually a good one, I think, for us for a variety of reasons. One of those would be when we go through hard times. Another one would be when we lose friends, relatives, family members, and I'm including pets in that. Sometimes when we suffer due to illness and so forth, we can begin to doubt God. It happens. There's also the idea that examining the reasons for the existence of God will strengthen our faith, or it can strengthen our faith, right? So let's get right to it. I imagine that some of you are sitting here thinking, well, you cannot prove that God exists scientifically. It's a matter of faith. Well, okay, hold that thought. We'll get back to that idea. It's a good one. But let me start the message as we explore this topic. But before I go any further, ask yourself a question. It's on the next slide. That's it right there. Okay. Do you believe that there is a God? Now, I happen to know the faces in this room, so I think I know the answer therefore to that question. But just imagine other people sitting here and thinking about this question. Could you, though, explain to your neighbor or someone in your family who is not a believer, maybe a stranger, why you believe there is a God, if you do believe there is a God? Next slide. I can tell you that when any professor at Texas A&M or any other school or college or university teaches students about proving anything scientifically, you're talking about experimentation in that case. And we teach the scientific method for that. And I dare say that these days, students are being taught the scientific method at a pretty early age in their education, in high school science classes, for instance. Whether they fully understand it or not at that time is another question, but what is involved in the scientific method anyway? Well, when I was teaching at A&M, I did go over the scientific method in all of my classes with the Aggies. And I did it essentially the same way, no matter what the course was. You will first identify a problem that you want to study. And then you develop some hypothesis statements about the problem, what you expect, okay? And after that, you have to devise a way to obtain data that is going to help you find out the answer to the question or the problem that is in the forefront of the research. And then you design these experiments using specific treatments and controls, very important, so that you obtain data that is appropriate for the question and that you can then analyze and come to some kind of a conclusion. You always go back to your original hypothesis statements and see whether they're true or false. Anyway, that's a very rough draft of the scientific method. It provides a blueprint, though, I would call it, about observing phenomena in the universe, no matter what it might be. And so we have these planned sequence of steps that I just outlined that we follow. And we use the 5 senses in science. It's not just thinking. Many times some of the other senses will come into play. Now, one takeaway from the scientific method is that if the results that you obtain in attempting to answer your question cannot be replicated, cannot be reproduced, cannot be duplicated by another research team somewhere else who conduct the same study as you to verify it, to validate it, then you have to wonder if your results represent reality. Really. And if you go to publish that kind of research, the peers who review your study before it's published will probably kick it back and reject it. So this scientific method is interesting, to say the least. But I wanted to mention it because it affects our belief in what we observe, right, regarding the truth and what is real. That's what it's all about, whether it's nutrition research or physics or whatever it is. Now, I dare say it would be an accurate statement that many of us who work in science and who conduct research investigations using the scientific method will rarely ask the question, now, how does this affect my belief in God? But it's actually a very good question to ask. Many people hold to the belief that faith in God is nothing more than superstition, and that humans invented the idea of God and created God in their own image. When we know it's right. But I believe there's evidence that demonstrates the existence of God, and I will start by sharing with you what I know on this subject this morning. Now, I am not opposed to the scientific method at all. As I told you, I use it when I teach. I'd also like to say that I recognize it has limitations in its application. Okay? In other words, outside of the lab. For example, think back to the last time that you thought you had a good idea. My idea, blank, fill in the blanks. Maybe that was in the distant past, but maybe it was yesterday for some. Maybe even this morning. Did you have a good idea? Well, my point is, you cannot scientifically prove an idea. You cannot scientifically prove an idea or a thought using that scientific method. So what I'm suggesting here is that there's more to the scientific method and the five senses when it comes to what we believe. It's more than that. But as we will see, we can still suggest that something is proven even if it's not provable by the scientific method. It may instead be proven by other scientific approaches, such as the use of logic. The conclusion that God does not exist comes from a belief that the scientific method is all that we need to use to test the validity of anything that exists. If it cannot be proved, it therefore does not exist. Well, if anyone were to suggest that you should consider things outside of the realm of nature, beyond nature, in other words, which means the realm of the supernatural, again, that suggestion would strike many people on the street that you're either superstitious or ignorant or brainwashed, right? Let's listen to Paul in 1 Timothy 6, verse 20. O Timothy, keep that which is committed to thy trust, avoiding profane and vain babblings and oppositions of science falsely so called. Did you ever know that verse was in there? Brings in science like that. Some translations will use the word knowledge there, as science embodies knowledge, of course. But science, we should understand, is incomplete. That's one thing that we have to admit as scientists. Human knowledge through science is incomplete. Science does not know all there is to know about the universe. And in my field of nutrition, I can tell you that that field changes almost daily in terms of what is known and what is discarded as fact. In fact, the dietary guidelines that come out roughly every 5 years out of Washington are updated, revised, and so forth because of new information. And one of the most recent sets of dietary guidelines completely reversed the guidance on cholesterol and dietary fat from what it had been. So, nutritionists do not know everything. If they say they do, they're lying. Okay. You probably remember the food guide pyramid. I'm not even going to say anything. Now, in addition, there exist forces of unbelief in our world, right? Atheism, humanism, evolutionism, not to mention what we've talked about many times, spiritual forces of evil. These have been very successful, actually, in convincing people that either, number one, God is dead, number two, God never existed in the first place. Folks may adopt a lifestyle and a credo that says, eat, drink, and be merry. In fact, my brother and I could tell you that we remember in my mother's kitchen, in the house we grew up in, she had painted over the cabinets, eat, drink, and be merry. You remember that, right? He's looking like, are you my brother? Well, my mother was British. What can I say? She was not an American. She was an artist, so she painted things like that struck her fancy. What about Paul? Paul in 1 Corinthians 15 essentially says something that touches on those words. It says that if there is no resurrection of Jesus and of the dead, then we are to be pitied for believing it, and should instead eat, drink, and be merry. Why? For tomorrow we die. So this would be consequences for us if the reality is that there is no God, and this godless life is the one we are faced to live. Wouldn't have any hope. Next slide. However, Paul goes on to explain, and the verse is this one behind me. A few verses. But Christ has indeed been raised from the dead, the firstfruits of those who have fallen asleep. For since death came through a man, the resurrection of the dead comes also through a man. For as in Adam all die, in Christ all shall be made alive. So now, on this more hopeful note, it's time to begin to provide you some arguments regarding proof that God exists. When I say arguments, I don't mean like people yelling and screaming at each other. I mean discussions, invoking valid points and counterpoint. Now I asked the question at the beginning, if you believe in God, so I can ask next, if you do, why do you believe in God? Is it because you grew up in the church and it was expected of you by, let's say, your mom and dad, and you never questioned that? I've seen that. Is it because of evidence that you have been given? Is it because of reading the scriptures or hearing a message or watching the Ten Commandments movie or listening to Mahler's Second Symphony, The Resurrection? Well, you probably need to ask and answer those questions to yourself, because they are fundamental questions after all, from which your faith becomes established and built. Or not. If the basic questions of God's existence is not answered definitively and conclusively for you in your life, then guess what? Your faith is not set upon a very firm foundation. So the first argument for the existence of God is this one. It's called the cosmological argument. How many people are familiar with this? Well, it's good that I'm talking about it. Okay. And I had heard about it a few years back, quite a few, and I had to buy myself a book by Francis Schaeffer about the universe and its existence and about God. And he talked about these things. So I want to give him a nod on some of this content that I'm sharing with you. We need to consider what this cosmological argument is all about. as we look for any proof or evidence of God's existence. Now, if you're ready to know about the cosmological argument, it doesn't mean, if you know it already, that you can leave. You need to stay here, and for this reason, so that you can take the information and edify, educate, increase the knowledge of those who may not know what this is all about. Okay? They may not yet know what they need to know and what they need to think and talk about regarding this issue. So the next slide. The cosmological argument is also called the first cause argument, or the first mover argument. Aristotle, Plato, these great philosophers from antiquity, said that every effect must have a reason or a cause. Just think for a moment how simple and yet how profound that statement really is. Don't you wish you were the one who had come up with it? I know, I wish I had. Good old thinkers. If we apply the argument here to our universe, it becomes something like this. Every effect must have a cause, the universe being an example of such an effect. Therefore, the universe has a first cause. It didn't just happen magically or mysteriously. So this may be viewed by some that the first cause is God, while by others, the first cause is chance, or the first cause is the Big Bang. That wasn't a very big bang. But the key here is that one can postulate that the first cause may indeed have been God. If we understand the logic of this, then we can better appreciate the scripture that's coming up on the next slide. For since the creation of the world, God's invisible qualities, his eternal power and divine nature, have been clearly seen, being understood from what has been made, so that people are without excuse. How many folks know that from Bible study? Okay, that's a very good verse to memorize, Romans 1:20. So the Bible attests to the existence of a created universe as proof of a creator God. Paul is admonishing, actually, those who claim there is no God by saying, essentially, you idiots, creation itself is ample evidence of God's existence. So we want to examine this argument further and ask, is it reasonable? Is it rational? Is it logical? Or is it the opposite? I think we all would say that it is reasonable and rational and logical, just as Paul attests. Now, the second argument is called the teleological argument. There it is. How many folks have heard about this one? I'm guessing if you haven't heard about the cosmological, then this one either. Okay. So the term teleology refers to explanations that appeal to design and purpose. Design and purpose. So the teleological argument claims that the appearance of design and purpose in nature implies a designer. You may have heard the analogy, if you see a watch, you can pretty much imagine that it was designed by someone and that it has a purpose. It's telling me it's about 10 after 11. Purpose to tell time, designer, Timex, whoever. Teleological arguments broadly suggest that some observations are more reasonably explained as resulting from purpose and design, rather than as chance or random accidents. If there is no creator who made the universe and gave it a purpose, then we are left with a random, mechanical universe with absolutely no plan or purpose to it. People who subscribe to this sort of idea tend to think of a force or a power that is somehow behind the origin and the continuation of such a mechanical universe. No matter how statistically improbable and unlikely that such a reality is. A, quote, side effect of believing that the universe was started by and continues to operate by an impersonal and mechanical force is that those who believe this way have no obligation, no accountability to a supreme holy being, because they deny that one exists. However, as Paul reminds us, as he did remind us just a moment ago, we look around at the universe, we see not only design, we also see the reason for the design of the universe, a plan. Let's look next, on the next slide, at Isaiah 25, verse 1. O Lord, you are my God. I will exalt you. I will give thanks to your name, for you have worked wonders, plans formed long ago, with perfect faithfulness. Notice that word, plan. If there's a reason for the design, a plan, then that is the proof that we do not live in a mechanical, just by chance universe. The force that brought the universe into being, and I use the word force there in quotes, is therefore intelligent. It is a thinking and planning being. This is exactly what the Bible tells the reader. By contrast, a non-life, mechanical force, Luke, use the force. Okay, very popular in sci-fi. Is not rational, is not science or scientific at all. Okay, next slide. Another idea to go along with that of a designer and a planner for the universe that exists is that the being who is behind it all is above all human ability. Above all human ability. And to a superlative degree. Just a little bit. To a superlative degree. So that's a big and bold statement. Let's think about it. Think about it from our experiences with other people. Individuals exhibit differing degrees of intelligence, right? But I think you would agree, even the most intelligent person who ever lived, with the highest genius IQ, is far from having the intelligence to design and create the universe. Another thing we could talk about is time and the longevity of a human being. In the days when our nation was founded, it was common for someone to live only as long as 50 or 60 years. In biblical times, we read of Methuselah, who lived how long? 969 years. Imagine living that long and having kids. At what age do you kick them out of the house? Okay, children, you're 352 years old now. Time to move along. Start a life of your own. Get out. The question is, in order to live long enough, to be smart enough, and to have enough knowledge and wisdom and skill to create a universe, it's clear that even if we lived 1,000 years, we're not getting anywhere. And now today we live nowhere near that number of years, right? You know what the average lifespan is right now in this country? It's 78 years. Okay. Doesn't mean that's as old as we can get. No, that's average. There's actually 40 years beyond that to play with, okay, depending on your lifestyle choices, genetics, and so forth. Okay. And now today we live nowhere near that number of years, even though we are technologically and scientifically advanced, right? But why would that be? The other point is that scientists believe that the universe has been in existence for a long time. And you would probably think that being the being that created the universe would also be in existence for a long time. The Creator would have to be of superlative age as well, far beyond that of any human being. Another good question to ask is about how much power would it take to create the universe? People actually sit around and try to calculate that. Did you know? Well, it's more power than mankind has been able to harness. It's a creation power that is used in a way that is unknown to humans. So my point in all of this is that the creator of the universe has to be superlative in every aspect of being, whether it's strength, power, intelligence, wisdom. And that does not even cover the spiritual and moral attributes, such as holiness, righteousness, justice, grace, mercy, love, all again to the superlative degree, not just to the human degree. In short, the word that comes to mind, and this is what the Bible presents to us, is, we had it in the verse, perfection. God is perfect in all his ways. He is complete in his ways that transcends all things in the universe and the universe itself. So I'm going to stop here for now. Resume next time, Lord willing, next Sunday. Speaking of perfection, the Lord Jesus, we just sang about him being the lion and also the lamb, was perfect. Was even perfect as a lowly man who was born, lived, and died on this earth. For it says in the next slide, in Hebrews 1:3, this about Jesus. He is the radiance of the glory of God and the exact imprint of his nature, and he upholds the universe by the word of his power. After making purification for sins, he sat down at the right hand of the Majesty on high. Did you catch that choice morsel? We're told by this verse how the universe is actually held together by the word of his power. Try to quantify that, Mr. or Mrs. Scientist out there. We can invert these words and pretty much understand it the same way by the power of his word. Remember that the Lord spoke creation into existence, right? This means that the same God who spoke the universe into existence maintains it today through the same godly power that only he has. And Hebrews 2:10 tells us something specific about the perfection of the God we serve. Something that remarkably involves us in his perfection. Do you recall what that is? It's an amazing verse, Hebrews 2:10. Tells us that through his sufferings on the cross for our sins, the man Jesus became perfect, and that the resulting salvation itself that is offered continues this perfection, and we can share in it. Allow me then to read this verse as we close. It's on the next slide. For it was fitting that he, for whom and by whom all things exist, in bringing many sons to glory, should make the founder of their salvation perfect through suffering. It really ties in nicely to Elsa's communion verse. Alrighty. Do you know the God who exists? If you do not, we would ask you to begin considering the evidence that we're going to share and responding to his call for your life. What is that call? It's a call for a life of obedience to his perfect will. If you want to become a member of this church, where the truth is taught and preached, we invite you to consider joining this group of believers, this group of sinners, as they seek to worship the Lord in spirit and in truth.
My hope is built on nothing less